In the village of Stretton Baskerville in Warwickshire, sometime around 1497, the last remaining families are evicted from their homes. The village has been declining for years, its open fields converted piecemeal to sheep pasture, its common land enclosed behind hedgerows, its agricultural labourers made redundant by a landlord who has calculated that 1,000 sheep require fewer wages than 50 farm workers and generate more income per acre than grain. The houses stand empty for a season or two, then begin to fall. The church loses its congregation and eventually its roof. Within a generation, Stretton Baskerville exists only as a name on old documents and a pattern of earthworks visible in certain lights across the grass of what had been its fields. The ghost of a community that functioned for centuries and then disappeared in a decade, not from plague or war or flood, but from a landlord's arithmetic. Stretton Baskerville is not an isolated case. Across the English Midlands in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, hundreds of villages undergo the same process: depopulated, converted, erased, as the profitability of wool production over grain cultivation collides with the traditional land tenure system that has organized English rural life for centuries. The process has a name that becomes, over the following 3 centuries, one of the most contested concepts in English economic history: enclosure. And what enclosure does, across its long and uneven history from the Tudor period to the early Victorian era, is not merely change who owns the land or how it is farmed. It fundamentally transforms the relationship between the English population and the means of its own subsistence, converting a peasantry with legal rights of access to common resources into a landless proletariat with nothing to sell but its labor. In doing so, it creates the precondition without which the Industrial Revolution, as it actually happened in England, could not have happened at all. To understand what enclosure destroys, it is necessary to understand what the open field system actually is and what common rights actually mean in the lives of the people who hold them. The agricultural system of medieval and early modern England is organized around the open field. Large, unfenced fields divided into strips, with each tenant household farming a scattered collection of strips across the different fields of the village, rotating crops and fallow according to the communal schedule that the village manages collectively. Alongside the open fields, the village maintains areas of common land, meadow, heath, woodland, waste, over which the members of the community hold legally recognized rights of use: the right to graze a specific number of animals, the right to gather wood for fuel, the right to cut peat or reeds, the right to glean the field after harvest, collecting the grain left behind by the reapers. These rights are not charity. They are property, customary property, embedded in the legal fabric of manorial tenure, enforceable in the courts of common law, as real in their legal status as the strips of arable land to which they attach. What common rights mean in practice is that a household with limited cash income and limited arable tenure can nonetheless maintain a degree of economic independence from the wage labor market. A family with common grazing rights can keep a cow or a few sheep, producing milk and wool for domestic use without purchasing them. A family with wood-gathering rights can heat its home without paying for fuel. The right to glean after harvest provides a meaningful supplement to the household grain supply in a good year. None of these rights makes a poor rural household wealthy, but collectively they provide a cushion of subsistence security, a floor beneath which the household cannot easily fall, regardless of what happens in the labor market, regardless of whether a particular harvest fails or a particular landlord decides to reduce wages. The common is, in the most literal sense, the resource that makes it possible for the rural poor to survive independently of complete dependence on employment. Enclosure removes this flaw. It converts common land, collectively managed, collectively accessed, into private property, individually owned and individually managed, from which the former commoners are legally excluded. The hedgerows and ditches that physically mark the boundaries of enclosed land are not merely agricultural features. They are the material expression of a property transformation, the visible evidence that something that was once common has become private. that access which was once a legal right has become trespass. The first major wave of enclosure, concentrated in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, is driven primarily by the economics of the wool trade. English wool and English woolen cloth are among the most valuable export commodities in European commerce, and the market for them is expanding steadily through the 15th century as the Flemish textile industry absorbs English raw wool, and as English finished cloth finds markets across Northern Europe. A landlord who converts his arable open fields to enclosed sheep pasture can generate more income per acre from wool than from the grain rents that open field farming produces. And he can do it with dramatically fewer workers. A flock of 1,000 sheep requires a shepherd and a few assistants, rather than the dozens of tenant families whose labor cultivated the same acreage as arable strips. The human cost of this first enclosure wave is immediately visible and immediately documented. Thomas More, writing Utopia in 1516, provides the most famous contemporary description of what is happening. Sheep, he writes, which used to be so meek and easily kept, have become so greedy and fierce that they devour men themselves, that the conversion of arable land to pasture is depopulating entire villages, driving the rural poor off the land and into the roads, making vagabonds and thieves out of people who would have lived honestly as farmers if the enclosures had not destroyed the agricultural community that supported them. More's language is rhetorical, but his observation is accurate. The first enclosure wave produces a displaced rural population with nowhere to go and no legal means of subsistence, a population that the English state of the early 16th century has no mechanism to absorb or support. The state responds with the first anti-enclosure legislation. Statutes of 1489, 1515, and 1517 that prohibit the conversion of arable to pasture, mandate the restoration of depopulated villages, and establish commissioners to investigate and punish illegal enclosures. The legislation is enforced with enough vigor to slow the process in some areas, and a series of enclosure commissions over the following decades document hundreds of illegal conversions. But enforcement is uneven, and the economic incentive to enclose is powerful and persistent, and the legislation ultimately functions as a brake on the rate of enclosure rather than a reversal of the underlying process. The villages that are already gone do not come back. The families that are already displaced do not return to land that is now under sheep. The Midlands Revolt of 1607 is the most dramatic episode of collective resistance to enclosure in the Tudor and early Stuart period. An uprising of perhaps 5,000 men and women across Northamptonshire, Warwickshire, and Leicestershire who spend several weeks systematically filling in enclosure ditches and tearing down enclosure hedgerows, attempting by direct physical action to reverse the land transformation that legislation has failed to prevent. The rebels call themselves levelers and diggers, names that describe their method and their aspiration. And their grievances are articulated not as revolutionary demands for a new social order, but as conservative claims for the restoration of traditional rights that enclosure has violated. They want their commons back. They want their grazing rights restored. They want the hedgerows that have cut them off from land their families have used for generations to be removed. The revolt is suppressed by the local gentry, its leaders killed or imprisoned, and the process it protests continues. 4 decades later, a second and more philosophically articulate wave of resistance emerges from the disruptions of the English Civil War. In April 1649, a group led by Gerard Winstanley begins cultivating common land on St. George's Hill in Surrey, declaring that the earth is a common treasury for all and that the enclosure of common land by private landlords is a form of theft from the entire community. Winstanley's diggers, true levelers as they call themselves, occupy and farm commons in Surrey and several other counties for nearly a year before being evicted by local landlords using a combination of legal action and organized harassment. Their numbers are small and their practical achievement is minimal. But Winstanley articulates something that the Midlands rebels had expressed through action rather than argument. That the legal mechanism of enclosure is not a neutral property transaction, but a politically organized transfer of wealth from the many to the few, conducted through institutions controlled by the class that benefits from the transfer. The argument will not be widely heard for another 2 centuries. It is not wrong. The second and far more transformative wave of enclosure begins in earnest in the mid-18th century and reaches its peak between approximately 1750 and 1830, the same period during which the Industrial Revolution is transforming the economic character of England from an agricultural to an industrial society. This second wave operates through a different legal mechanism than the earlier informal enclosures. It operates through Parliament. The parliamentary enclosure process requires a local landowner or group of landowners to petition Parliament for a private act authorizing the enclosure of the open fields and commons of a specific parish. Parliament appoints enclosure commissioners to survey the land, assess the existing rights of all parties, and redistribute the land in consolidated private holdings proportional to each party's former rights. The process is, on paper, scrupulously legal and apparently fair. In practice, it is systematically biased toward the large landowners who initiate and control it. The commissioners are typically local figures with connections to the gentry rather than to the smallholding farmers and cottagers whose rights are being assessed. The legal costs of participating in an enclosure process, hiring a solicitor to present one's claims, attending the commission hearings, challenging adverse assessments, are beyond the means of most smallholders and entirely beyond the means of cottagers whose common rights, however real in customary law, are difficult to document in the formal legal terms the commissioners require. Commoners who cannot document their rights receive no compensation. Smallholders who receive a consolidated allotment in exchange for their scattered strips often find that the allotment, though equivalent in acreage, is less productive than the strips it replaces, located on poorer ground, without access to the common resources that made the strips viable, and that the cost of fencing their new allotment, which the Enclosure Act requires them to bear personally, exceeds their available capital. The smallholder who cannot afford to fence his allotment sells it, typically to the large landowner who initiated the enclosure, at a price that reflects his desperate need for cash rather than the land's actual value. The cottager whose common rights cannot be documented receives nothing at all and must find another way to survive. The agricultural laborer who worked the common fields as a tenant has no rights in the process and simply loses his livelihood as the open field system that employed him is replaced by consolidated farms managed with fewer workers. All three, the smallholder, the cottager, and the agricultural laborer, end up in the same place, without land, without common rights, without the subsistence cushion that had made rural poverty survivable, and with nothing to offer the labor market but their physical capacity for work. Between 1750 and 1850, roughly 7 million acres of open field and common land in England are enclosed through approximately 4,000 private acts of Parliament. 7 million acres is not an abstract statistic. It is the subsistence base of a significant fraction of the English rural population, converted from collective access to private ownership across a single century. The people displaced by this process do not vanish. They move. They move to Birmingham, to Manchester, to Leeds, to the mill towns of Lancashire and Yorkshire that are simultaneously being constructed to house the new industrial workforce that the factory system requires. They arrive in these cities without capital, without skills adapted to industrial production, without any resource except their labor. And they sell that labor to the factory owners and mill operators who need it, at whatever wage the market will bear, because they have nothing else. The conditions into which they move are documented with clinical precision by the factory inspectors and social investigators of the 1830s and 1840s. Manchester, in 1840, houses its factory population in back-to-back terraced housing, built without running water, without sanitation, without light, packed at densities that the rural villages from which the workers came never approached. The cellar dwellings of Liverpool, the court housing of Birmingham, the mill lodging houses of Bradford, all of them are full of people who arrived from the English countryside carrying nothing, who have no relatives in the city and no community networks to draw on, and who have discovered that the wage they earn in the factory, even working 14 hours a day, barely covers the rent for a space in a room shared with 3 other families. The enclosures have not merely displaced a population, They have removed every form of social and material security that rural common life provided and replaced it with nothing but the wage. A wage set by employers who know that the alternative their workers face is the workhouse. The wage that the market bears in the first decades of the Industrial Revolution is very low, and it is low precisely because the supply of landless labor is so large. The enclosures have created, over the course of a century, an enormous pool of workers who cannot afford to be selective about employment because they have no alternative source of subsistence to fall back on. A factory worker, who is also a smallholder with common grazing rights and a vegetable garden, can afford to reject wage offers below a certain threshold, because below that threshold, he can supplement his income from his own land and common resources. A factory worker who is a former commoner with no land, no rights, and no savings cannot afford to reject any wage offer that covers his rent and basic food costs, because the alternative is destitution. The Industrial Revolution's factories are staffed by workers in the second position, not the first, and the difference determines the wage level at which industrialization becomes profitable for the mill owners. The Speen-Hamlin system, introduced in 1795 by Berkshire magistrates and rapidly adopted across southern England, is the clearest illustration of what the enclosures have made of the rural poor. Facing a population of agricultural laborers whose wages have fallen below subsistence level, as the enclosures have concentrated land in fewer hands and reduced the number of independent farming households, the magistrates devise a system of poor relief that supplements wages to a minimum subsistence level based on the price of bread and the size of the laborer's family. The state is, in effect, subsidizing employers who pay below subsistence wages by making up the difference from the parish poor rate, transferring money from property taxpayers to factory owners and large farmers who are themselves the principal property taxpayers, through the mediation of a welfare system that ensures the displaced poor do not starve to death in ways that would create political instability. The Poor Law of 1834, which abolishes the Speen-Hamlin system and replaces outdoor relief with the workhouse, an institution deliberately designed to be sufficiently miserable that only the truly desperate would choose it over any available wage employment, completes the transformation of the English rural and urban poor into a fully proletarianized labor force. The workhouse does not offer subsistence. It offers bare survival at the cost of total institutional control, family separation, and social stigma so severe that accepting it represents the final acknowledgement that one has nothing. The deterrent effect is the point. A labor force that will accept any wage above the workhouse floor is a labor force with no effective bargaining power. And a labor force with no effective bargaining power is the foundation on which the profitability of early industrial capitalism is built. Oliver Goldsmith, writing his poem *The Deserted Village* in 1770, describes a community in the process of enclosure-driven disappearance with the same mixture of grief and political anger that Thomas More brought to the same subject 2.5 centuries earlier. The village he describes, Auburn, almost certainly based on real communities he had observed in rural England and Ireland, is losing its population to consolidation, its common land to enclosure, its independent farming households to displacement. Goldsmith writes as a poet and moralist, not as an economist. But what he is describing is the same mechanism that More described, operating now at the larger scale made possible by parliamentary power, reshaping the human geography of England in ways that the industrial cities growing in the north are already beginning to absorb. The Industrial Revolution requires a proletariat, a class of people who own no productive property, who have no means of subsistence independent of wage employment, and who must therefore sell their labor at whatever price the market offers because the alternative is starvation. This class does not exist in sufficient numbers at the beginning of the 16th century. It exists in overwhelming numbers by the beginning of the 19th. The Enclosure Movement creates it, acre by acre, hedgerow by hedgerow, parliamentary act by parliamentary act, across 3.5 centuries of systematic conversion of collective subsistence rights into private property. The factories do not cause the proletariat. The factories are built for the proletariat that the enclosures have already created. The Industrial Revolution is not merely a story of steam engines and mechanical looms and entrepreneurial genius. It is a story of what happens when the land that fed a population is taken from them, and what they are forced to do next.